Okay, it's recording now. So now I switch to today's presentation. So today's speaker is Nathan Anderson. He's a 2010 agronomy graduate who is currently working in his own farm, which named Bobolink Prairie Farm in Northwest Iowa, along with his wife, Sarah. He's an active partner with Iowa Learning Farms and board member of Practical Farmers of Iowa. He works on cover crops, rotational grazing, wide row corn, which is just opposite to what we are doing. He grows in 30 inches versus 60 inches. Then aphid-resistant soybean, soil health, and honeybees. He has also been spreading his knowledge and skills through various field days and group meetings on habitat conservation. He has also been testified before House for Agriculture Subcommittee on Conservation and Forestry. More important, or very interestingly, he started teaching his kid when he was 3 years old about tractors, cows, and other farm activities. So with that, I would switch to the screen to Nathan. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and I'm very humbled and thankful to be with you today virtually. This is a really special experience for me as someone with only a bachelor's degree to lecture to graduate students, professors, and my advisors and agronomic professionals out in the field. So not an opportunity that I thought I would have, so I'm grateful to have it. I would echo a couple things that Ram said. If you have clarification questions as I'm talking through, please feel free to type those in the chat box and I'll try to answer them or see them or use the raise your hand function. And the seminar co-chairs can hopefully pass that clarification question on to me. If it's something more detailed, we'll have some time at the end for questions as well. And on the topic of questions, our field days, when we host a field day on our farm, one of the first things that we always do is to go around the circle of attendees, have everyone introduce themselves, where they're from, what farm or what their ideal farm might look like if they were able to farm, and then always ask what question they came with today. What question was in your mind when you came, and in this case, when you logged onto your computer to listen to the seminar, what question might be in your mind, or what question did you hope that I would answer throughout the course of this discussion today? So if you could, you can type those in the chat box too, and we can come back to them later towards the end. We might answer a couple of them as we go through if they pertain to one of the topics that's on my list. Or you can jot them down as well as a reminder to ask at the end. That would be great as well. And I do want to say this is a little bit strange as a speaker to be speaking to a bunch of little boxes in the corner. So please feel free to interact using the chat box. If you would like, you're welcome to turn your camera on. Please keep your sound or your microphone muted, but I'd enjoy seeing who I'm speaking to if possible. No pressure, but if possible, that would be great.
Ned, so Dr. Brian.
If we have the bandwidth.
Okay. I had a question from Dr.
Yeah.
Brian. He wanted to know what's happening on the farm in the state.
What's happening on the farm? Let's say that again. It cut out just a second.
So it says, what is happening on farm in the state?
I believe it was just a very general, like, we just want to hear about what's happening on farms in the state. And so we're very excited for the presentation.
So on happening, I won't speak for the whole state, but just briefly, our farm still has its corn crop standing upright and not laying down. Even though it is showing considerable drought stress. We are about 11 inches behind on rainfall for the season. We're hauling water to the cows in the pasture, and the well went dry at the pasture, so we're pumping water from a nearby acreage, hauling it to cows in the pasture, and we're about 10 days away from hauling hay to the cows as well. So that's our farm landscape picture right now, but I'll take a standing crop over one that's laid down. So that's my little farm perspective from the corner. And I see Joel DeYoung's on the talk, so I've got someone to commiserate with dry crops that are still standing. So to start with the introductions of our farm, Ram mentioned my wife, Sarah. And if you pause the recording here, Ram, that would be great. And start the recording back up there, Ram, if you haven't already. So our outline today, I just want to talk a little bit of our farm's approach to and our challenges in implementing change as we look towards the future. I'll give an example and walk through our 30 versus 60-inch row corn experiment with interseeded cover crops that we've done as just an example of that process. And then I'm going to end with just some big picture questions and how we hope to answer them. And I think you all in the professions that you're in the roles that you have can play a big part in helping us to answer those questions and to implement changes on the landscape. So the good news for a lot of the changes that we're trying to implement on our farm is that we already know the solutions. All of you in your professions are very good at giving us the agronomic answers to questions that we have. The basic agronomic principles haven't changed. They are explained very well by a number of folks at Iowa State, and I'm looking at the list of participants in this call and frequently read some of their publications that allow us the knowledge that we need to make those changes. The breakdown that we have in making those changes is that we have to implement them on our farm, which there's a challenge in implementation. And then we also need to have the emotional and motivational drive to be willing to make those changes, especially ones that go against the grain of what normally appears on the landscape. And that's one of the biggest challenges for us, that change on our farming operation relies on me as an individual being comfortable with the end result of that change. It includes the in-field practice itself, but it also includes like social capital and your social capital bank account, personal energy and resiliency, the joy that comes from making the change and the process of making the change, the enjoyment that you get out of whatever particular enterprise or practice that you're putting on the landscape, things like what mom and dad will say, what the neighbors will think. Those things all impact change on the landscape. And as graduate students and professors, instructors at a land-grant university, I want you to know that your work is appreciated, but sometimes we might struggle to use the data that you all generate to implement change on the landscape. And I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you today because of those reasons. And one of the big takeaways that I want to have is that we make change when we feel that we have permission to do so. And that permission can come internally, externally. There's a number of different ways that it can come, but we make change when we have permission to do so, or when we feel we have permission to do so. And for some reason, there we go. I'm a little slow on the Zoom as a host. I've participated, but haven't had an opportunity to have a host role. So bear with me as I transfer through from slide to slide. So making change on our farm for reasons like Fletcher over here pulling a water hemp, when we have the emotional driver that our water hemp issue and our need to control it, which we know from the science that a cover crop can suppress water hemp, when that emotional need and financial need in some cases to control water hemp is greater than the impact of planting a cover crop right next to a state highway and then no-tilling beans into a cereal rye cover crop that's higher than the planter, and what the neighbors and folks driving by might think about that, then we're able to implement that change. And so it's important as a farmer to have the networks and people both in research and academia and then in other farmers who are using these practices that allow us that support system and that structure to make changes take place on the landscape. And I don't know if he's on, I didn't see if he was there yet, but a shout out to Matt Liebman. I worked in his lab for one of his graduate students when I was at Iowa State, and his work is a great example of generating very good data that's applicable on the landscape, and the adoption lags what the data would show that the adoption should be. And I'm sure many of you as researchers might feel that same way. Farmers are a tough crowd sometimes. So keep working on us. We'll come around eventually. And grad students as well, I want you to know that you can change the landscape too, using those same things. The project that I wanted to highlight on our farm is the 60 and 30-inch corn trial that we've conducted for the last 2 years. And the reason that I wanted to highlight this is because it helps me to articulate and helps other people to understand our process for implementing a management change on the landscape. So the primary driver for us for trying this practice on the field that we're trying it is connecting a forage chain for livestock. So we're trying to generate a higher quality feed stuff in the fall and early winter of the year using the interseeded cover crop that's seeded at V4 or so into wider row corn. So we're trying to generate feed for cattle. I'm also trying to, in this field next to the pasture, we typically use corn on corn for a couple years in a row before breaking to soybeans, to hay, or hay in a small grain or soybeans in a small grain. Because the corn in this place allows us a place to turn cattle out in the fall while we're harvesting, and this field keeps them occupied while we're harvesting a significant portion of the rest of our crop. And so it decreases my labor demands in the fall for the livestock when we're busy in the field with harvest. So I'm looking at feed for cattle. I'm looking to decrease the corn on corn penalty with residue by having a wider space, that 60-inch row space, where when I plant corn on corn, particularly no-till corn on corn, I have plenty of space between the rows that I can get good seed to soil contact without having a residue problem or last year's root balls in the way of that planting field operation. I'm also interested in things like that diverse cover crop that's got flowering species in it, like flax and buckwheat, and the beneficial insects that might attract to our field, and possible corn pest predation that goes along with it. So that's the thought process that leads us to ask the question, is this something that we can try on our farm? And a big part of that process is with Practical Farmers of Iowa and the farmers in that network who are conducting these on-farm research trials. And so they allow us the opportunity to network with other farmers who are talking over the implementation of a changed practice. We're talking about things like planter settings. And for the trial, how do we orient our rows with our planter so that we can double plant our 60-inch row spacing? So we have 2 rows right next to each other, as you can see in the image on the right. and then the gap. So we're planting twice in the 60-inch strip. So how do we orient our planter passes so we can do that? How far apart do we put those strips so we can still harvest them with a corn head, but not interfere with what's going on in between the rows? How do we change our fertilizer setup? For us, we're side dressing nitrogen with a drag hose or a Y-drop type of system. So how do we change our fertilizer setup to get that nitrogen and sulfur in some cases right next to the corn plant when it's on a 60-inch spacing versus a 30-inch spacing? So that group of farmers allows us the opportunity to network and figure out how to implement this practice. And again, that support network is really critical as we go through. And it also helps to talk with them and other agronomic professionals to talk about cover crop seed mixes, what species we would have depending on the seeding practice that we're using. In the pictures that you have here, this seed was broadcast. So the seed mix is on the bottom. It was seeded at the timing of the picture on the right, and the picture on the left, you can see that cover crop just emerging. And this is last year. This was the 2019 year for this trial. So that seeding mix, we picked smaller seeds because we were broadcasting and not putting it directly in the ground, which, as again, basic agronomic principles, if you're seeding something, it does better in the ground than on top of it, with few exceptions. So we tried to pick seed species that would give us the best chance of success given the method that we were using. Again, because the implementation of this practice, we're interested in trying it, but we haven't made an investment in equipment yet that would be able to seed that cover crop species in between the rows in this setup. So we're kind of hedging our bets a little bit and trying the practice as best we can without investing too many dollars in equipment in something that's unproven on our farm. So these are just a couple pictures as we go through the season. The picture on the left is mid-July of 2019. The picture on the right is harvest time last year, which was mid-October of last year. And as professionals in graduate agronomy, I had there we go. I'm sure that all of you are interested in seeing some of the data that's generated from it. I'll just highlight Anderson is the stuff from our farm. So in the 30-inch rows, I grew 35 pounds of biomass with an interseeded cover crop. In the 60-inch rows, it was 671 pounds of biomass per acre, which is significantly different. However, if you look at the other experimenters, other farmers that were participating in that trial, I was the one trying to graze it for livestock, and I was the worst at raising cover crop biomass. So I have a few lessons to learn from my peer farmers. And then, excuse me, have a few lessons to learn, but it's also encouraging to know that there is a significant cover crop biomass difference between those two practices. The information in gray on the bottom is a cover crop, the pounds of nitrogen per acre that's contained in that residue. So that cover crop does have significantly more nitrogen in it than in the 30-inch rows. And that nitrogen is good to be held up by the crop. And it also could be in the form of protein that might be beneficial for my cow herd going into winter when they're grazing a low protein feed stuff like corn stover out in the field. So these are a couple of questions that we had that we're able to answer as part of this process. However, our goal in implementing this practice was to do those things of generating feed and maintain corn yield. We didn't maintain corn yield. We saw about a 15 bushel an acre yield decline in the 60-inch rows, which was statistically significant. But it gave us incentive to try it again and see what we could do better for this year, for the trial that we did this year. So this year, we again conducted the practice changing a few different things. We slid our wide rows a little bit closer together. We changed our row cleaner setup so we weren't throwing residue from the first planter, from the second planter pass onto what was planted the first time. We changed our fertility program a little bit, and the picture on the left is just after planting when I was stream bar fertilizing that crop, and the picture on the right is shortly after emergence. And as with any cropping system, you eventually run into problems that may be environmental, which in this case they were. So these pictures, the picture on the right was taken about a week ago, and the picture on the left was taken about a year ago. So you can see the significance that the drought has had on the success of this practice on our farm. However, we're still able to answer some of the questions that we have. One of the questions that came up is, how do we maintain weed control in that wide row spacing? And the answer to the weed control is cover crop biomass, but the answer to the cover crop biomass suppressing weeds is not found in the picture to the right. So that picture of the trial that we've done and the work that we've done with that trial is just an example of using information that's out there already, taking the questions that we have on our farm or the goals that we're trying to accomplish on our farm, using that knowledge, figuring out with our peers and other farmers how to implement that knowledge on our farm, and then seeing that practice through, using folks like Stefan and Haley at PFI that can conduct statistical analysis for us, that can set up our field trial strips with replication so that we can generate good data to help us make decisions. And we're looking at all of these things in the realm of the system of our farming operation. And that's one of the challenges and the questions, and I think the opportunities that we see going forward, and that I see at institutions like Iowa State, is there's a lot of future in systems thinking, and there's a lot of applicability in systems thinking to answer these bigger agronomic questions and these bigger socioeconomic questions in rural Iowa by using some systems thinking approach that can, instead of isolating individual components to research individual components, which is still valuable, looking at the system as a whole and not overanalyzing any individual part, but analyzing the system as a whole. And that's, again, one of the reasons why I mentioned Dr. Matt Liebman's research. Again, there's other great examples, but his is one that I have a little bit of firsthand experience in seeing some of the steps going into it. So for the future, I often ask the question of, again, as a Practical Farmers of Iowa board member, one of the missions is building resilient farms and rural communities. And I often ask the question of, how do I build a resilient farmer? Because that's me. I'm the farmer. I'm interested in being on this landscape for a long time. And I think the answer to that, one of the answers to that question, is no different than a way that you build a resilient ecological system, and that's by having connectedness and diversity on the landscape and the different components of the system that work together, producing outcomes that benefit other components of the system. And I think as a farmer, I often ask that question of, how do we make resilient farmers and rural communities for the future? It relies on networks and diversity, and that's the outward component of it. The personal reflection of that is a really personal question of, do I have what it takes to care for this landscape, this farm, and this family for the rest of my lifetime? As a farmer, that's what I'm getting at when I'm asking about, how do I make myself a resilient farmer, and how do I build a resilient farm for the future? And again, that's an internal question too of, can I do this for a lifetime? There's other questions. I could spend a good chunk of the afternoon listing a bunch of agronomic and cropping system questions that I have. One of the other big ones that I've had lately is, what crop on our farm replaces or partially replaces corn? And the reason I ask that question is, as we look at the declining demand for ethanol and the adoption of electric vehicles, corn rootworm resistance, other pest pressures in the corn cropping system, how does our farm do that? And again, the personal reflection to that question is, what crop or crops or enterprises replace my primary income source for the decade that I've been farming? Because that's what corn ethanol has really been to our farm. Corn has been the primary income source, and ethanol has been the primary market for that primary crop. So that's a big question that I have. I have a lot of other questions that come up that I'd love to work with any one of you on, and some of them are, just personal preference, and some of them are maybe agronomic. I'd like to have a grad student on our farm. I've talked to about half a dozen Northwest Iowa farmers that use cover crops and different cropping systems and livestock on the landscape. And, we try to do some of the research, but I'm not interested in getting a master's degree. I'm not a great writer yet, so I haven't published, a research paper in any way, shape, or form. And so maybe there's somebody that would use our farm as a site to conduct some of their research and can learn alongside and contribute some work onto our farm as they're conducting that research. And I think that would be a great opportunity. So I have a question about that. Interns, long-term career employees. My dad's 65, so I have a question about labor on the farm. Business structure, diversity on the landscape. I often have a question about longevity of higher institutions and the ability to continue to conduct applicable research that we can use on our farming operations, because those land-grant institutions have been under some stress in the past, and COVID, I think, has illustrated some more of that stress. I have some really personal just wants of a system, and one of the wants that I have, I think, is highlighted, and I'd like to swim in our local lake all summer long without a water quality advisory or anything like that. And then I was reflecting on that statement and thought that I'd also like to feel like I have the time to go swim in a local lake at any point in the summer, because it's really easy to just stay involved in the farm and not be deliberate about taking that time to get away. I'd like to raise 300 bushel corn with interseeded cover crops, maybe not on 60-inch rows, but in 30-inch rows or some other row spacing with interseeded cover crops. That'd be fun. I'd like to cut our environmental impact. I'd like to cut our nitrogen loss and our phosphorus loss and our carbon emissions. And I think the kind of summary as I'm thinking about all of these different things is, I'd like more diverse enterprises on the farm, a better work-life balance, basically have a more resilient me for a more resilient family, for a more resilient farm, for a long-term future of communities in rural Iowa. And so I think that's what I want for the future. And this picture exemplifies how we're going to do it. This is a picture from one of our field days, one of our first field days back in 2011, of just a group. There's a couple farmers in here. There's a reporter in here. There's a couple researchers in here, just taking a pasture walk and taking notes and jotting down ideas, and sharing what we're learning and what we want to learn and what questions we come up with. So that's how we're going to do it, I think, is to answer those questions is in that way. And I like this picture just because it's fun. I realize I'm talking to agronomists, but cattle have more personality than corn plants, in my opinion. So apologize for continuing to show cattle pictures when it's an agronomy discussion, but this is a picture of cattle following me. and a little background to the story before I close and we get to some questions. But I was training my cows to eat weeds because a number of weeds have nutritional value, but cattle just haven't seen other cows eat them, or they didn't see their mom eat them when they were growing up. And so I'm teaching them that there are some plant species that they don't eat that are okay to eat. And in this case, they're following me across the pasture through some pretty lush grass to eat chopped up thistle in a tub because it's got a little molasses dressing on it. And they had been trained that whatever I put in that tub is a good new food for them to try. And so it just took a little bit of persuasion, a little bit of treat along the way. And these cows will walk right over the lush green stuff that they're on to follow me to eat something that has value, but they don't even know what the nutritional value is. But it has value as a feedstock, and they're just trusting that I'm going to give them something good to eat. So that's why they're following me there. So I like that story and that image because they're just walking through green grass to eat thistle, and it's humorous to me. So the last point I would say is that this is my email address, this is my cell phone number. You're welcome to shoot me an email, give me a call. Any of you are welcome to stop out to the farm. We'd be glad to have you. COVID restrictions might put a hold on that for a little bit, but whenever those get lifted, or if you want to do it socially distant, you're welcome to do that. We'd be glad to have you. Harvest is going to start a little early this year, so keep that in mind too if you're thinking of coming up this fall. So we appreciate that. I'd be glad to open it for questions. I don't know if I haven't looked to see if there were some questions that came in already. But if you do, please feel free to ask some questions. We've got some time to chat. Again, thanks for the opportunity to be with you today. It's really a privilege to visit and start off the semester for this seminar.
Thank you, Nate. I'm sure if we were in the 2050, you'd have a lot of round of applause. There is a reaction button. Feel free to use it as well. We did have one question. If you don't mind me reading it out to you.
Yeah, go ahead.
And I'm sorry, it has a username, so I'm really not sure who it is. But K Delate, my initial observations are showing 60-inch corn not faring as well as 30 inches. Maybe more structural support overall in the 30-inch rows, and then after derecho. So I don't know if you want to comment a bit on that.
Yeah, so I believe, would that be Dr. Dellett? I'm thinking, I took a course from her, I think, back in college. I'm not sure if she remembers me or not, but I did take a course, if that's what that username is. That's a great question. So in our area, we haven't seen significant wind to know if it's faring better structurally or not. Our stocks are, for this time of year, relatively compromised, primarily due to drought. And I'm not sure the difference in stalk integrity between the 60 and the 30-inch rows. I do know that with that twin row setup that we have in our 60-inch row planting, we're planting 2 rows right next to each other, that anytime you do that and you have a slight delay in emergence, or just a slight hiccup of any kind, that those later corn plants, those stalks are definitely going to be weaker than those in the 30-inch rows, and then the neighboring stalks in the 60-inch rows. So I would only be speculating from a wind standpoint, but I would say you could definitely see some potential. The reverse to that is in 60-inch rows, you've got more sunlight lower in the canopy, so maybe you hold on to some stalk integrity later by holding on to those lower leaves. It's a good question. I don't know the answer for sure. I would say our stalk integrity this year is more compromised by drought.
So Nathan,
Go ahead.
There is one more question from Laura. She says you talked about your own work, input, and community opinion affecting your decisions to try a new practice. But what about economic impacts? Have any of your experiments helped hurt the economics of the farm, and how do you decide a threshold for what is worth trying? Mm-hmm. And that's the question. What do you think, Nathan?
So that's a great question. You can see the data from the 30 and 60-inch rows, and that going to 60-inch rows is really not an economically viable decision unless I can grow more cover crop biomass. That was why I tried it again. This year I did not succeed in that practice. And so then the yield question remains for this year of how much is the yield difference between the 60 and 30-inch corn. So I think based on what I have seen with this trial, what I've also seen with interseeded cover crops in 30-inch rows, just doing the interseeding earlier and using different species that can tolerate more shading, like different clovers, that method of interseeding might preserve my yield, but still help us meet our goal of a cover crop at the end of the season. An example of something that's been economically viable for us is using cover crops in especially grazing scenarios where I can even establishing a cover crop in the fall, grazing the following spring, or if I can establish the cover crop into standing corn at black layer and graze in the fall, if I use species like spring barley and turnips or something along those lines, oats would fall into that category. That's a really economically viable option for us too. No-till has been a good thing for us. I don't know how we would get our work done if we tried to till everything and then plant everything. In 2019, with the wet weather we had, it just wouldn't have happened. We wouldn't have been able to get the crop in the ground if we had to do 2 field operations instead of 1. So that's been an economically viable thing for us. And I would say cover crops in areas that have weed pressure in soybeans have been really economically viable. And I think there's a lot of data to support that one as well. We need to figure out how we can successfully implement and get those cover crops established on a regular basis so that we can see that consistent positive weed suppression impact. And that's been one of our bigger challenges. But that practice itself, the cover crop costs us $10 to $15 an acre, somewhere in that neighborhood. And if you look at the nutrient value that cover crop holds up, and then the weed suppression value, last year I had one field with the best cover crop residue, which was actually that image that I showed of planting into the high cover crop residue, where I just had a pre-plant burn down and a pre-emerge residual herbicide and no post-emergence herbicide whatsoever in that field. And so that can easily pay for that cover crop. So there's a couple economically viable ones. On the grazing side, on the livestock side, rotational grazing, management intensive grazing, it's been tougher this year with the drought, but anything that we can do to move those cows more frequently is economically viable. We see really good gains in animal health. We maintain per day gains in our calves while having more animals on the landscape. So we wean more pounds of beef per acre using systems like that. So there's a few of them. Hopefully that answers the question. Dr. Lamke, I think you were starting to ask a question.
You get unmuted. No, I was just kind of curious, Nathan, on what your plant densities were in the 60-inch rows and why you chose to do twin rows instead of just a single row.
That's a good question. So why I chose to do twin rows over a single row is because I didn't feel like my planter could singulate well enough to plant 68,000 seeds in a single row. So what I have instead are 2 34,000 planted population, 2 rows at 34,000 34,000 seeds right adjacent to each other in that twin row setup. So it's possible that my planter could have done that. And I think it would have alleviated some of my challenges of planting, just the logistics of planting twice. I'm turning off part of the planter to plant these 8-row blocks, or these 8-row strips of the 60-inch row spacing. So it would have helped with some of that. I think it could have worked, but also a couple other participants in the trial were using that twin row setup too. And so part of it was to kind of be consistent with some of the others in that trial. So.
No, I was just wondering, I mean, we're seeing effect of plant arrangement on rooting, how corn plants root. And I'm wondering if you're not running into rooting issues in that planting system, but we can chat about this another time and how we can get to that. So
I would, just based on some of the digging that I've done, I would highly suspect I'm running into rooting issues, where you have two plants adjacent to each other whose roots are trying to grow out, versus plants, even if they're close in a line, they can all grow out.
Yeah.
So that might be part of what you're getting at anyway. And based on some of the digging that I've done, I would say that's absolutely a root growth limiting factor. And I would say if it's a root growth limiting factor, it's probably going to be a yield or a nutrient factor as well.
Especially this year.
Mm-hmm.
We have one more question from Dr. Bradley Miller. He's a soil scientist, and he's wondering how he can serve better to the farmers. So what soil questions you have that you already have answered, and what else you want to know from soil scientists?
So Dr. Miller, appreciate the question. He was just Bradley Miller when I was at Iowa State, so it's come a long way. Great to have your question. So I think one of the biggest soil information questions that I have, and this is maybe a little bit outside of what you're getting at. I wish I had a better understanding of what properties in my soil and what nutrients in my soil allow for better plant uptake. So it's a soil plant interaction question, but basically it's what nutrients do I have that I can actually use in the plant? And there's some soil tests that get at that. And there's a number of mechanisms that go into uptake, and you have the pH question as well, and that question gets at what do I need to fertilize, or what levels do I need to add fertility, and what methods can I use to get the nutrients that are there more successfully into the plant. I think those are my soil related questions. And again, I think that's a little bit outside of what you're asking, because it's a soil plant interaction question. But that's the soil question that I'm interested in. There's a lot of soil things that I'm interested in, and my sister Amber teaches a couple undergraduate courses in agronomy at Iowa State, and she was up with that probe truck for a while. So if you want to come back up with that, just like for the week, sometime after the crop is harvested, that would be great, Dr. Miller. We could just drive around, and that would help answer some of the questions that I have. I also have questions about soil carbon at depth, and I know Dr. Castellano has had some work on that. I often question our soil organic matter. We're in our soil test that we do for our crop production, we have shown increases in organic matter. And I think the data would show that that's not really doing anything for soil carbon, because those annual crops really aren't contributing a lot of root volume into that system. But I'd be interested to have a better understanding of soil carbon in the annual cropping system, and what we can do to bring back carbon deeper into the profile within the system that we have. And I think the answer is probably you need deep-rooted perennials on the landscape if you want to do that. But I'd be curious to get a better understanding of soil carbon dynamics. So I think those are my top couple. And I did pull up the chat box, so I can see the next couple questions. Is it all right if I move into those couple?
Yep.
The question from Ellen: have you considered grazing native perennial plant, or considered native perennial plants for cattle grazing? And the answer is yes. We have areas of our pasture where we have a number of native plant species and native plant communities, especially under some of our restored bur oak savanna areas. So we have, in parts of our, I call it pasture, grassland, savanna, we've cleared a number of cedar trees, like 17 acres of cedar trees so far in our 60-acre pasture, because they're native, but they're really encroaching on these grassland areas. And 30, 40, 50 years ago, they weren't on this landscape, especially to the extent that we see now. And so we're removing those cedar trees, seeding some short-term cover crop or some non-invasive, grass species, not like smooth brome, that can really be sod forming. So we're seeding some species back into those areas, managing our grazing so we can allow those native plants back, and then bringing fire and burn regimen back onto the landscape too. And so we're implementing a number of those different things. The native perennial plants that we have grazed are really in limited areas in the pasture. The biggest, the predominant forage species are cool season grasses. So we do have some warm season native perennials, but the majority is cool season introduced grass species. Then the next question from Luis. Are you considering to implement irrigation in the future? That's a good question. I often ask that question too of, there's a shortage of water this year, so the answer should be irrigation, but I had a tremendous amount of water last year. So the answer is drainage tile. And I feel like the two of them together maybe don't accomplish what I'm trying to accomplish. And so I've considered irrigation. I've considered the system I've looked at, probably more than others, would be like the sub irrigation with the small poly lines that are run on like 30-inch centers, plowed in 2 feet down or so. So that's what I've looked at. It's really costly to do. And I feel like, again, if I'm trying to get rid of water in the spring or get rid of water one year and I want it back the next, I'm not quite sure if the answer is irrigation or not. In our pasture, I'm looking at incorporating some elements of keyline design, some water harvesting and distribution systems where our pasture is set up with a number of ravines, and there's the knuckle comparison of like you have a ridge and a ravine, a ridge and a ravine. And if you create small dams and a shallow terrace, basically, you can pull water from higher up on the landscape that's in those ravines where it's wet and pull that water out around on the hillside, and transport that water, make that water travel further across your landscape before it leaves. And that would allow us to incorporate, again, maybe some seeding of some bur oak trees or some other tree species on some of these really open grass hillsides that would be well suited to a savanna type arrangement if we could consistently get those trees established and, again, manage our grazing around it. So considered irrigation, not tremendously seriously. I often ask the question in a year like this, though.
Any other question for Nathan? Yeah, looks like not. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming and listening to Nathan. Thank you so much, Nathan, for sharing all this valuable information with us today. And
Thank you for having me. And I just wanted to echo again, if you have any further questions, email, cell phone are available right there. You're more than welcome to contact me. And if you would like, you can contact one of the co-chairs to get that information if you don't jot it down for later. So I appreciate the opportunity to be with you today. It's been a great experience. I hope it's been valuable use of your time for an afternoon, and look forward to the work that you all will do and continue to do. And I'll read about it in some papers coming up, I'm sure.
Yeah, let me finish with announcing that we're going to be having Dr. Emily Heaton next week.